Have you ever just stopped and thought about the sheer amount of data that's out there?
Yeah.
I mean, seriously, it's kind of mind-blowing when you really think about it.
It is pretty crazy. It's like we're swimming in this ocean of information, right? But,
Yeah,
the thing is, without a way to make sense of it all, it's basically just noise.
you're totally right. And that's where this thing called data parsing comes in.
Yeah, exactly.
It might sound a little technical at first, but the idea is actually pretty simple. Think of it this way. Imagine you've got this instruction manual, but it's written in some crazy code you can't understand.
Mm-hmm.
Data parsing is like having someone who can not only decode that language, but then they organize all those instructions into a clear step-by-step guide.
Yeah, it's like translating a book from a language you don't know into one you do.
Right, that you can
Yeah.
actually use. And that's what it does for all this raw data that's floating around.
Makes it useful. And it's especially important now because there's just so much data coming from everywhere. You've got social media, scientific research, sensor data from all these internet-connected devices. We need a way to make sense of it all.
So for this deep dive, we've been looking into this developer's guide all about data parsing. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, a developer's guide? Really? But stick with us on this one, because even if you're not a coder, understanding how data is organized behind the scenes, I think gives you a really interesting view of how the digital world actually works.
Absolutely. And the funny thing is, the basic ideas aren't actually that complicated, but they have a huge impact on everything these days. Businesses, our daily lives, you name it. I mean, think about this. Companies spend something like 45% of their time just getting their data ready to be analyzed. And parsing is a big part of that.
Wow, that's a lot of time. So for this deep dive, our mission is to really break down what data parsing is, why it's so important right now, and also talk a bit about how this whole process is evolving. And we'll do it all without getting too technical.
Right, we'll keep it accessible.
So let's start with the basics. What's actually happening when we talk about parsing data?
Okay, so imagine you've got this big box of puzzle pieces, but they're all jumbled up. No organization whatsoever.
Total chaos.
Right. Parsing is like taking those pieces and first sorting them out, maybe by color, maybe by shape, and then you actually start putting them together based on the picture on the box. That's essentially what data parsing does. It takes raw data, which could be anything really, and breaks it down into smaller, more manageable chunks. Then it looks at how all those pieces relate to each other and creates some structure out of it.
So it's not just breaking things apart, it's about understanding how those parts fit together in the bigger picture.
Exactly. It's about creating order from disorder.
Got it. Now, this developer's guide talks about two main components in the parsing process: a lexical analyzer and a syntactic analyzer.
Yeah, these are like the two main players.
Can you walk us through what each one does?
Sure. So the lexical analyzer, sometimes called the lexer or tokenizer, is the first one up. It goes through the raw data character by character and groups them into meaningful units called tokens. Tokens are basically like the building blocks of data.
So it's like identifying the words and punctuation marks in a sentence.
Yeah, exactly. Or it could be like identifying keywords and symbols in code. Each of these is a token. Then the syntactic analyzer, which is often just called the parser, comes in and takes those tokens from the lexer. It then processes them based on a specific set of rules. These rules are called the grammar. The grammar is basically like the blueprint for how the data should be organized.
Interesting. So the lexer is like the organizer, sorting out the raw data. And the parser is like the architect, making sure everything's in the right place according to the plan.
That's a good way to think about it.
Now, the guide mentions something called top-down and bottom-up parsing. What's the difference between those approaches?
So these are two main strategies that the parser can use. With top-down parsing, you start with the overall structure of the data, kind of like the big picture. Then you break it down step by step into smaller and smaller parts until it matches the tokens that the lexer gave you. It's like starting with the blueprint for a Lego model and then trying to fit all the individual bricks together to build that model.
So top-down is like starting with the big picture and working your way down to the details.
Right. And bottom-up is the opposite. You start with the individual tokens and then try to build them up into larger and larger structures following those grammar rules.
So bottom-up is like starting with the individual Lego bricks and putting them together to build the model without necessarily looking at the blueprint first.
That's the idea. Now, which approach works better really depends on the specific data you're dealing with and the complexity of the rules you're using.
Makes sense. Now, one thing that really caught my eye in the guide is how AI and machine learning are starting to be used in data parsing. How is it changing things?
Oh, it's pretty exciting, actually. AI and machine learning are allowing us to deal with much more complex data and also data that's not as predictable.
So data that doesn't fit neatly into those predefined rules.
Exactly. See, traditional parsers, they rely on very strict rules. But with AI, we can train models to recognize patterns and structures even when the data is kind of messy or inconsistent.
So it's like teaching the parser to be more flexible and intuitive.
Exactly. It's like moving from a strict rule book to more of a gut feeling, but a really smart gut feeling based on tons of data.
Now let's talk about some of the real-world data formats. The guide mentions JSON, XML, and CSV as examples of structured data formats. How are those typically parsed?
So these structured formats, they have pretty clear rules and organization, which makes them fairly easy to parse. JSON, for example, is often used in web APIs and configuration files. It uses a simple key-value pair structure, so JSON parsers just navigate that structure and pull out the values they need.
Yeah, so JSON is all about those key value pairs.
Right. Then you've got XML, which is common in enterprise systems and document processing. XML uses tags to define elements and their attributes. So XML parsers create a sort of tree-like representation of the document based on those tags, showing how all the elements are nested within each other. And lastly, CSV, which stands for comma-separated values, is really popular for spreadsheets and tabular data. CSV parsers just split the data into rows and columns based on commas or tabs.
So for those structured formats, it sounds like there are well-established ways to parse them.
Right. It's generally pretty straightforward.
But what about unstructured data, like natural language, HTML, and PDFs? Those seem like they'd be much trickier to parse.
Yeah, they definitely can be. For natural language, you need a parser that can actually understand the meaning of the text. Not just identify the individual words, it needs to understand the context, recognize entities like people and places, and even deal with things like sarcasm. It's where natural language processing, or NLP, comes in. It uses a whole bunch of different techniques to extract meaning and structure from human language.
So it's like teaching the parser to read and understand like a human.
In a way, yes. And then there's HTML. HTML is used to create web pages, and it does have a structure defined by tags, but sometimes it can be messy or inconsistent. HTML parsers, like those used in web scraping tools, have to navigate that structure and extract the specific content you're looking for.
Okay, so HTML can be a bit of a wild card.
Yeah, sometimes. And then you've got PDFs. PDFs can be really complex because they can contain text, images, all sorts of embedded objects, and it's not always obvious how it's all organized.
Like a digital mystery box.
Kind of. So PDF parsing often requires special libraries and techniques to handle all the different ways PDFs can be formatted.
The guide actually talks about this really interesting case study about an e-commerce retailer that completely transformed their business by using data parsing. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, this is a great example. So this big online retailer, they were getting product data from like 20 different suppliers, and each supplier was using their own file format. Imagine the headache.
Oh man, I can only imagine.
And they were getting over 1 million product updates every day. It was just too much to handle manually. So they implemented this automated data parsing system that could handle all those different formats. And get this, they were able to reduce their data processing time by 75%.
Wow, that's huge.
It is. That means they could get product information to their customers way faster and more reliably. It's a perfect example of how powerful data parsing can be.
It sounds like it was a game changer for them. And it's not just e-commerce, right? The guide talks about how data parsing is having a big impact on other industries too.
Yeah, it's being used everywhere. In finance, for example, it's helping companies process transactions faster and make better risk assessments. We're talking about a 40% increase in speed for some of these processes.
That's significant.
It is. And in healthcare, it's helping to reduce errors in medical records and insurance claims. They've seen something like a 65% reduction in errors, which obviously is a really big deal when you're talking about people's health.
Absolutely. Accuracy is critical.
Right. And even in manufacturing, companies are using data parsing to improve their supply chains and product quality. We're talking about a 30% improvement in efficiency for some companies.
Those are some pretty impressive results. Clearly, data parsing is making a real difference across lots of different industries.
Never dared about it.
Now, the guide also has some great insights from developers who are actually working with data parsing every day. What are some of the things they say are important to keep in mind?
Well, one thing that came up a lot is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to data parsing. It really depends on the specific project and the kind of data you're working with. But there are some general tips that they all seem to agree on, like starting with the simplest approach possible. You don't always need fancy tools for every job. Sometimes simple string manipulation techniques can work just fine.
Keep it simple.
Right. But they also say it's important to recognize when you do need more specialized tools like regular expressions or dedicated parsing libraries.
So know your tools and when to use them.
Exactly. Another thing that came up a lot is the importance of error handling. Developers know that real-world data is messy and often unpredictable. So you need to build in ways to catch errors early on to avoid bigger problems down the line.
It's like having a safety net.
Yes, exactly. And did you know that something like 68% of data quality issues are actually caused by errors during the parsing stage?
Wow, that's a lot.
It is. So error handling is super important. They also talk about thinking about performance and memory usage, especially when you're dealing with lots of data. And they always recommend using well-established libraries and tools whenever possible. And of course, testing everything thoroughly with real-world data.
Test, test, test.
Always.
Okay, so that's a great overview of some best practices. Now let's look ahead a bit. What are some of the exciting trends emerging in data parsing? The guide mentioned things like AI, edge computing, and even quantum computing.
Yeah, the future of data parsing is definitely looking interesting. We can expect AI to play an even bigger role, helping us to extract insights from increasingly complex and unstructured data. Things like natural language processing and computer vision are going to be huge.
So AI is going to take data parsing to a whole new level.
Absolutely. And then there's edge computing, which is all about processing data
Yeah.
closer to where it's generated. That's going to be really important for real-time applications, like analyzing data from IoT devices.
So faster and more efficient parsing.
Exactly. And then further down the line, we might even see quantum computing start to play a role. Quantum computers have the potential to process information exponentially faster than traditional computers. So that could completely revolutionize how we parse massive and complex data sets.
That's pretty mind-blowing. And to show just how important data parsing is becoming, the guide mentions that the market for data parsing tools is expected to grow significantly in the coming years.
Yeah, they're predicting it'll reach $5.2 billion by 2025. That's a pretty big market.
So clearly, data parsing is a field that's on the rise.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up our deep dive today, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember about data parsing?
I think the most important thing to remember is that even though it often happens behind the scenes, data parsing is this fundamental process that makes all this raw data around us usable. It turns that data into something we can understand and use to make decisions, to improve things. Without it, all that data would just be noise.
It's the unsung hero of the data world.
Exactly.
And it really makes you think, doesn't it? All this data is constantly being generated all around us, from social media to sensors and everything in between. It's like a never-ending fire hose of information.
Right.
And it's the work of data parsing that takes all that information and turns it into something meaningful. It's really pretty incredible.
It is pretty
It
amazing.
makes you appreciate the power of this process that most of us probably never even think about.
It's definitely something to think about.
So next time you're scrolling through your social media feed or using your favorite app, just remember that data parsing is working behind the scenes to make it all possible.
And making our lives a little bit easier in the process.
Exactly. So that's our deep dive into the fascinating world of data parsing. Until next time, stay curious.